The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, we heard from Brad Treliving on Thursday for the first time since the Leafs were eliminated from the playoffs. I know there's a lot to get into. What would you say is the biggest takeaway you thought of from his press conference on Thursday?
Probably how cordial he was when discussing the Marner situation. And, I think there's good reason for that. They're still basically, this is a breakup. And I think they're deciding how it's all going to work and how it's going to go down. And we can get into this a little bit, but, it still remains to be seen. Is there a world that the Leafs trade Marner's rights before free agency? Can they get something tangible back for doing so? That certainly isn't determined at this stage, how exactly that would play out. So, I think that Brad Treliving naturally wanted to be civil about it all, but let's face it, the Leafs are in a difficult spot. He's in a difficult spot as a team's GM because, they have a 102-point player that appears to want to test free agency, that hasn't wanted to negotiate with them, that didn't waive his no movement clause, not to revisit all the history, but he's in a tough spot when you get a month away from free agency and there's still no clarity on, basically how this breakup will go. I'll say, the one thing we didn't hear from Brad Treliving is an affirmative, I want to keep Mitch Marner. We think we have a pretty good idea what Mitch Marner wants to do, and he's had ample opportunity to say that he wants to stay. And so I was most curious about that. Brad Treliving ended up speaking for 50 minutes on Thursday, which is a pretty long time as these things go. And he probably didn't say too many things that made headlines beyond, what I'm inferring from what he did and didn't say about Marner. I mean, it was that's probably a win if you're in his shoes right now, is that you could talk for that long and there aren't 7 quotes that are like, wow. And because let's face it, he doesn't have all the answers just yet. So, I thought he was as forthright as he could be. I appreciated how much time he took to go through all the queries. I don't know how much we learned really, other than my high level takeaway was that he played pretty nice in the sandbox with Marner, given that this is probably not the best of times to be navigating that situation with no leverage as he doesn't have right now.
Yeah. It's hard to think that there isn't going to be some kind of change, whether it's Marner or somebody else, when you have comments like there's some DNA that has to change on our team. When you keep getting the same result, there's some DNA that needs to change. What did you take of that particular quote?
It was the first time, and look, this only is the end of his second season as GM. So, and because Brendan Shanahan's no longer here, it's relevant to still talk about the 9-year history of the team. But now we're no longer, when we're talking about the people or the person in this case addressing it, he wasn't part of all that. But it was the first time we heard Brad Treliving kind of get closer to acknowledging that he thinks the way the Leafs have lost as often as they've lost, getting to the big game, being 0-6 in the Game 7 situation, that there's some scars there related to that it's not all just positive experience, that there's some negatives. He talked about DNA without, and he was asked to follow up by Jonas Siegel, didn't get too specific on that. I would infer that he means fundamental changes to the team. I'm not a scientist. Your DNA is like your molecular makeup, right? Like it doesn't it in its truest form mean literally like what the parts that make you at a fundamental base level. Sorry for any science teachers out there that happen to listen to our show in their spare time and are probably like yelling at
don't come here for science.
At least not that steering wheel or going like, Johnson, didn't you pay attention? Probably not enough. But
what did they teach with Goldberg?
Well, it was a different time, Julian. But I'll say this: the DNA comment, I think he means that they need to change the frickin' team. And the funny part is that was that was a line he gave as part of his prepared remarks. So that was like thought about ahead of time, right? And that is definitely you seized on it, but you're not the only one. Like I noticed that was the quote that kind of buzzed around. My only small issue with it is The Leafs aren't changing their DNA. Mitch Marner is choosing not to come back and sign with the Leafs. Like, the DNA is being imposed upon them. Now, obviously, there's other choices there. I will say this. Brad Treliving was way less committal about John Tavares returning than I might have thought he would be. Just in his remarks. I mean, he said lots of nice things about Tavares, but definitely made it seem like that's an open question as opposed to maybe something that's sort of a foregone conclusion that he'll be back. And so maybe that will be a choice that alters the quote unquote DNA. But the biggest change that appears is going to happen here is the Leafs losing a 102-point player, Team Canada player, someone who's up for a Selke trophy in the past, but also can be your top scorer. And they don't have really, they're not going to have a say in it unless something really weird happens here. And so, yeah, the DNA is changing it's being imposed upon you. And frankly, this organization and really Brendan Shanahan, ultimately as the top voice, has been against those kind of changes in the past. Well, so now it's coming to your front door. So, I'm really not picking on Treliving per se, but I'm just saying, like, yeah, of course things are changing. I still feel like everyone's catching up to like what's happening here. Like, let's have some real talk for a minute. Mitch Marner is totally his right. Like, every part of this is his right. The CBA allows you to play out your contract naturally, right? Did not want to negotiate an extension. He contractually had negotiated a no movement clause. He did not want to waive that or consider waiving that in season on a trade that would have brought Mikko Rantanen back to the Maple Leafs. Now we get to the offseason and, May 18th, the Leafs lose Game 7 to Florida. He's asked about his future. Past tense is where he goes. 2 days later, after his exit meeting, asked, do you want to be back with the Maple Leafs? I've always loved it here. Past tense. This guy is walking out the door. And I still feel like everyone's sort of scared to say that for some reason. I suppose, again, part of it could just be down to you want to keep relations as good as possible here because, Marner's no move clause also applies to trading his rights. In the past, those kind of deals, and I've mentioned this before, but those kind of deals haven't been particularly fruitful for teams that have done them. You look at Carolina getting a 3rd round pick, the most recent example last year for Jake Gensel. But let's face it, Mitch Marner, different kind of player, maybe a little bit bigger market. And so there's more advantage for a team that might acquire him ahead of the deadline to get his rights. They might be willing to trade something of material value more than a pick, maybe a player that could be useful. For Mitch Marner personally, it's an 8-year contract that he could get if he was to be traded to where he signs next ahead of July 1st or on the morning of July 1st. Anyway, I just think that everyone, it's 11 days after the Leafs season ended. It's a little unusual to have this GM availability so late. Obviously, the Shanahan news that, Brad Treliving also mentioned he was at his daughter's graduation over the weekend. So things got pushed back a little bit. But it still feels like there's this delayed idea about what's going on here. I mean, what's going on here is one of the best players in the league is walking away. And the Leafs have, they're going to have to figure out how to move forward without him. And that's what they're in the process of doing this week. The Leafs have scouting meetings going on right now, pro scouting meetings. They got all their key decision makers in town, and they're starting to chart that path forward. And so Brad Treliving wasn't in a spot in this particular availability to get into any of that too deeply, but that's where we're at. I think to pretend otherwise, we're just wasting everyone's time.
Can I one thing about the Marner situation, just because I've seen people say, hey, if there's a way to trade his rights and get something. I mean, the NMC plays a role into this, obviously, but if I'm a GM of another team and all I keep hearing, particularly from you, that he's going to leave, he's going to test the market, why would I throw out an asset to get him? I guess there is the 8th year you could get if you negotiate a deal with him, but why throw out a 2nd or a 3rd round pick when even if you only get him for max 7 years, you don't have to throw out anything? I just didn't understand why there was so many people quick to suggest that. And that's just maybe more fans, not necessarily you, but
no,
you get what I mean.
It's a completely fair question. I think the answer, you have to think about it the other side. It guarantees you get his rights, right? I mean, even when you're a free agent spot, and even if you've maybe even done some tampering and you have an idea you might get him, you don't know you have them till you have them, right? Whereas if you make that trade on June 28th, let's say it's around the draft time, you have him. And part of that agreement, of course, part of a condition of the trade probably is signing the player. And so it's a way to get certainty for you. The other thing is having an 8th year has value for the player. Of course, it's an extra year of making money, but maybe that gets the overall AAV down a little bit. I'm using round numbers. I'm not reporting on this. This is just like as an example. Maybe Mitch Marner's price as a 7-year free agent is $13 million. Well, maybe he goes to $12.75 if you're doing an 8-year deal, right? And so the reason to do it is maybe you're able to get the AAV down a little bit. You get that certainty. And let's face it, the player you might be trading off your roster, maybe you want to, for whatever reason, get rid of that player because you have cap struggles or whatever. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a draft pick. And so I think there's all kinds of reasons it could go that way. So I think it's too soon to say whether it will or not. There's been some indication. I should say my TSN colleague, Darren Dreger, has reported that he doesn't believe Marner's all that willing to waive his no movement clause for this reason. I'm certainly not doubting Darren's reporting. I just don't know that myself. I'll just say on that point, though, let's see how it plays out. Let's see if it gets closer to July 1st. There's more information out there. There is 1 or 2 desired destinations. Maybe it makes a difference to the team. Maybe the team really wants an 8th year, right? Like there's a lot of, I guess there's still unknowns when we're this far away from July 1st about how that's going to go down. But I think that there are reasons to do it for other teams. And probably chief among them is, if not, you get to July 1st yourself and you can't be 100% sure he's yours. And what happens if he signs somewhere else? Well, there isn't another Mitch Marner out there, right? He's kind of one of one in terms of what he does, also in terms of what you pay him and all those sorts of things. So, I think that certainty could be beneficial. But I can also play the other side here where, a big part of why Mitch Marner has wanted to play out till July 1st and not sign even with the Leafs is he wants to see what the market yields. And so maybe he's not willing to give up that chance. That's part of the dance that I think happens this month as we get into June here and get closer to the free agents' decisions itself. But it's going to be interesting. There could be some way to salvage a little bit of, I won't call it face. I mean, there's no happy spin to put on the idea of losing a 28-year-old player at 102 points this year. But maybe if you get back a tangible player or something real, it might lessen the blow a little bit. Certainly, I think if Marner chooses, again, his right not to be traded and it comes out that he's the one or his camp is the one that's driving that decision, it's going to be seen as, a little bit of a flipped finger on the way out of town. I don't know how else you could view that.
Okay. So Marner's one situation, but what about Tavares? If you could put a percentage on how likely he could end up staying after all this. I understand that Brad Treliving and the Leafs still have to sort things out over these next couple of days and weeks, but I'm very curious about Tavares' future with this organization, if there is one.
I'll go 70-30 he stays. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Leafs need not 1, but 2 centermen to be acquired or signed or somehow procured this offseason. I don't see a lot of clear upgrades that are going to be out there in free agency. That's not to say there aren't any, but let's not lose sight of what John Tavares is still. He is a player who scored 38 goals this year and had 74 points and still has great hands around the net and looks after himself and treats everybody right and is a pretty damn good hockey player that I think if he were to ever go to the open market himself would still have a vast array of teams trying to bring him in. And he wants to stay so badly. And so even though the Leafs and Brad Treliving wasn't very committal on this front, I just think that those two things are going to keep bringing those parties together, and it's going to come down to a deal. And maybe part of what the Leafs are doing here and what the GM's doing here is just lowering the expectations a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit of the negotiation, right? Like a little bit of discomfort there by not making it sound so optimistic as certainly Tavares himself made it sound when he met reporters on May 20th. He said he just come out of a meeting with Treliving and Craig Berube, and he felt really optimistic about his chance to return. So, I still think it's likely they end up together because the Leafs need a center. There's not that many centers available, and John Tavares really wants to stay in Toronto. So I'll stick to that more optimistic bent. But I mean, if you had asked me this without those comments today, maybe it's more like 90-10. Like I certainly, it's been lowered a little bit, but I still don't see where the solution would be. I mean, maybe it comes down to the DNA change, right? Tavares was the captain in Toronto for 5 years. He's been part of the team for 7. Maybe that's where that DNA quote shines through, but we're going to have to see. I think the proof will be in whether the Leafs actually walk away from a pretty productive player who really wants to be in their dressing room and in their city at a time when they need 2 of those things. I mean, we'll see, but I think they're still more likely than not that he stays.
Another question. Matthew Knies, Brad Treliving said he'd like to get a deal done with him as soon as possible. What does a deal with Matthew Knies look like? What do you think he gets from the Leafs?
Well, I look at the contract that Wyatt Johnston signed in Dallas and think that it would be hard to be more than that contract. That was an $8.4 million AAV. Now, that was only a 5-year deal. I don't think a 5-year term is too appealing, enticing for the Leafs. I feel like you're either doing sort of a 3-year contract or a 7 or 8 year deal. It's hard to go in that middle zone. Basically, just walks the guy to UFA still in his prime. You want to either be, if you're going a little higher in terms of how much money you're outlaying, you're going to want to buy some UFA years for that money. And then if you're going shorter and you're going to keep the numbers much lower. So, it's tough to peg an exact value, but I think something 8 times 8-ish is a pretty good. Like if you're throwing a dart at a board, that's in the range. And then the negotiation probably happens around that number. And then as you go back, it falls back the way, right? If you sign a 3-year deal, I could see his number being as low as, $4 to $5 million, because those would all be restricted free agent years. Obviously it's more time where that's still a big bump from what Knies has been making on his entry level contract, but it gives him time to establish himself more as a player. And, I think the expectation in 3 years from now would be that he's, got the kind of resume, assuming he's healthy and continues to improve, that he's getting a much bigger chunk then. So I think there's pros and cons. The Leafs as an organization have not done a good enough job. And look, some of this is way back history. We don't need to uncover, but they haven't got their players on the second deal signed 7-8 years. And I think that's been part of the reason that their salaries inflated higher and higher and higher. They had good players and those guys got to go back to the plate a little sooner. Treliving didn't show his hand in terms of what he's thinking, but I think in a world where Marner's leaving, so you do have a little more cap flexibility, I would be doing what you can to get him on an 8-year deal and, somewhere in that $7 to $8.5 million range. I don't know exactly where that number lands, but, you look at Matt Boldy. I mean, there's a lot of other players that have signed contracts like that have similar sort of platforms to this stage. And if you could get Knies to buy into that 8-year contract, I think it would be a massive win for the organization and obviously a big financial windfall for the player.
Okay. Anything else from Brad Treliving's press conference that we should touch on that I didn't ask you?
No, but the Leafs have given us a steady stream of news, even without news, the last few shows, haven't they? By delaying all these announcements. I think the next thing on the horizon in Toronto is we'll probably start to hear about some, unfortunately, people losing their jobs. I think behind the scenes, there's a lot of streamlining that's going on and really looking at how the front office functions. And then as we, next week, it's the NHL scouting combine, which not just the Leafs, but that's where everyone goes. And that's really where the off season starts to take flight. You get a lot of, agents and team people in the same spot. And of course they're there officially to interview draft prospects and test them, but they're also there to talk to each other about the off season. So the Leafs are getting their pro scouting meetings done now, sharpening what it looks like internally. And then, June, all hell breaks loose while the Stanley Cup gets going.
Oh, can't wait for the hell to break loose and for the Stanley Cup Final. We should move on to Jonathan Toews. He has reached out to his agent, Pat Brisson, to let him know that he will be, he intends on returning to the NHL and he'll be 100% committed to doing that. What's the latest you're hearing about Jonathan Toews?
Well, it's great news for him personally, right? I mean, as much as there was hope earlier in the year when he did that story with GQ and talked about some of the things he's been through to get his health in a good spot, I think there was a lot of uncertainty about whether Toews himself could play. And what he's done is spent the last couple of months skating, training like a hockey player again, not just staying in good physical shape as he had. Some as though he'd let himself go. But let's face it, this guy's had 2 complete years off playing and had some struggles even prior to that at the end of his time in Chicago in terms of getting games on the ice. And he feels he's at a spot where he's comfortable, seeing this come back through, that this isn't just an idea anymore, that even when he's got on the ice, and we've seen, courtesy of his social media, he's worked with Adam Oates and some other people in terms of, getting his skills back up and obviously getting his skating conditioning back, that he can play. And what Jonathan Toews will be probably the biggest question here. Teams themselves will be asking that. I think naturally, given who he is and what he's done, there'll be a lot of interest. But are you acquiring at 37 a player who's going to play spot duty for you? Can you see him on your power play? Can you count on him maybe to play even third line minutes or second line minutes? I mean, those are massive unknowns, but I think there'll be a huge amount of interest in Toews, really from a lot of the top teams in the league, because this kind of dovetails with what I was saying on the Tavares conversation in Toronto. But a lot of these teams need centermen, and there just aren't, there's not enough supply out there to meet all the demand. And so you're throwing in a player that's going to have a Hall of Fame induction one day, that's won multiple Stanley Cups and played all those big games for Team Canada. And, we know about his list of accolades. I realize there's some distance between what he was and what I think should be expected of him now, but you're almost buying some of those intangibles, and you're going to buy some possibility, especially, I think if teams get a chance to really get a look at him and see where he's at physically on the ice. So I think it's a great news story for Jonathan, because he's been through a lot to get here. And now I almost expect some of the best teams in the league to be knocking on Pat Brisson's door to see, what it's going to take to sign him and see if they can attract him. Because, I think it's hard to imagine any team that fancies itself a Stanley Cup contender isn't at least thinking, hey, can't we have a spot for this guy just in case he is back, just in case he can play? Because, just putting him in your dressing room, I think, is a positive, let alone what he might still be able to do on the ice.
Winnipeg, Toronto, anyone else fit the bill along those teams I've just mentioned?
Colorado, I could see a hole there. Obviously, they traded for Brock Nelson, but, he's a potential UFA. I mean, even a team like Florida, right? Let's see where everything ends up and lands with them, with Sam Bennett being a UFA on the other side of the Stanley Cup Final. But, especially if the cap outlay isn't that high. I mean, Tampa, to me, all the best teams in the league have to be looking at it, because the beauty about him at this age too is you can sign him to a contract that has a lot of bonuses in it. And those bonuses are eligible to be pushed to the next season in terms of if you go over the cap, you're basically deferring. I mean, you pay the money in real time, but you're deferring the effects of what that is on your cap situation for a year down the road. So, I just have to believe everybody's going to at least be making a call. I'm not saying he's going to be number one on the next free agent board, because obviously the Bennetts and the Marners and all the players near the top of that list are probably better positioned to make an immediate impact on a team. But there's real. This is a unique set circumstance, a unique situation. And the fact that he's green lighting this now, I mean, I think it's a good sign about what's going on with Toews' training behind the scenes.
Maybe it's too early to tell, because I know there's a free agent board coming from you at some point. Like, I'd love to know where you'd slot him if you had a top 50 to put in terms of top available free agents.
It's a good question.
It's really early.
Well, and I haven't done the exercise yet, but I literally have one on my screen that I've started. But it takes a little while to flesh these things out. Somewhere around the middle of the pack, 20 to 25 is probably fair. Who knows? I mean, I always say with these boards, I mean, there's a little bit of science, but there's also a little bit of art in there. I mean, you're talking about a player with big name, and just even I think the mystery around it in some ways almost improves, the standing. But I've still got him. I will have him below, I'm sure, like the Brad Marchands. Probably even his old buddy Patrick Kane will probably be ahead of him, because Kane's at least had a couple productive years in Detroit, come on the other side of his hip surgery. I mean, he was an unknown at that point. I mean, wouldn't it be something if someone tries to reunite them together? There's something to chew on. I have no idea if that's even a possibility, but it would be pretty cool from a sentimental standpoint. So I'm going to guess, without having yet done it, that he probably ends up somewhere in the middle. It might be a little lower than that, but this also isn't a year where after the first 10 or 15 names, there's not a lot of slam dunks. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be good players that sign, but there's a lot of sort of spins of the wheel, I guess, the lower you get on that list. And obviously Toews is still that, just because of, how little hockey's played in the last number of years.
For sure. Can't wait for that free agent board when it comes out, but let's not get too greedy, because you do have a trade board out available at The Athletic right now. The top 5, I'll just run through the top 5 here. Chris Kreider at number 1, Marco Rossi at number 2, Bowen Byram at number 3, Rasmus Anderson at number 4, and John Gibson at number 5. What's the latest you're hearing on some of those players available, particularly at the top end of your trade board?
Well, a variety of different circumstances there, right? I mean, Kreider can be seen as an extension of the decisions that have already started being made by the Rangers, moved on from some veteran players, including their captain, Jacob Trouba, last season. Obviously, Kreider's name was included in November when Chris Drury sent a note to the other GMs, just mentioning that he was available for trade. So it's not a total surprise that he would be out there. But, it does seem as though there's renewed attempts here to see about, finding him a new home. I believe he might be the longest tenured Ranger, certainly spent his entire NHL career with that organization, which spans over 1,000 games if you add up the regular season and playoff games that he's played. So, it's again, a big shift from where they've been to where they want to go. And while Kreider did have some health, challenges this year, I think he also struggled, and he's not alone with this, with everything that was going on around that team. Like, that was a disastrous season, really, in a lot of ways for the Rangers. At the end of the day, he's still someone who puts the puck in the net, and his contract isn't that onerous. And even if you look at things like the NHL Edge data, he still has pretty high-end speed bursts when compared to his peers. So, like, a lot of the things that have made him the player he was, I think, are still there. Now he's getting older. There's some questions, but I think that he's someone the Rangers are going to be able to move, and he has some control with a partial no trade clause, but he's number 1 on that list, I think, because he's still pretty appealing. I think that they're going to continue going in that direction. And it just seems as though there's, I think, while Kreider, I believe, would ultimately like to remain with the Rangers, I think maybe an understanding that this is probably going to happen. There's only so much he can do with having a partial no trade clause. So, I class him in one side, and then you said Marco Rossi, he's a player, and Bowen Byram. What they share in common is they're younger, of course, much younger than Kreider. They're both restricted free agents that need new contracts, that are both coming off career seasons. If you look individually in terms of points, and in Byram's case, I think most encouragingly is he played all 82 games in Buffalo after having a lot of health challenges earlier in his career. And, that means there's a big decision to be made. In the case of the Sabres, their issue is the left side of their decor is spoken for. Yeah, you've got Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power ahead of Bowen Byram. There's only so much minutes, opportunity, need, maybe for what he does. And so if you're signing Bowen Byram to the kind of contract he's likely going to command now, you're probably trading someone else, or maybe the easiest thing is to trade him. And so certainly the Sabres have been gauging to see what might be out there for him, what might make sense, because they do have, there's going to be a trickle-down effect one way or another. If they're signing him, I think it's someone else going out the door. Probably the more likely option, which is why he's so high on the board, is Byram himself is dealt. And with Rossi, what really showed through for the Wild in hindsight is this guy had 60 points this year, and it got to the playoffs, and he was their fourth-line center. He played 11 minutes a night. And, obviously for someone like him, I believe he's 5'9", listed 180-ish pounds. Not not big by the standards of what an NHL centerman can be, but he's putting up pretty big and increasingly big point totals. Are the Wild ready to pay him like a top six centerman? And I think that they have some questions internally about that. And, as I've mentioned, the center market isn't so fruitful out there. And so I think that all those, you combine all that together, and, he's someone who's available by trade as well. With Anderson, he's 1 year out from free agency. I think it's that one's almost just a little bit more self-explanatory. Does he line up with where Calgary wants to be? They're obviously refreshing a little bit. I won't call it a rebuild because, in fact, they've kind of resisted trading away, after the big moves of 2 years ago, some players. But, you're either signing him or you're probably thinking about trading him at some point in the next calendar year. I don't sense that there's any rush there, that they have to make that call today. But teams are certainly calling and wondering, and would be an upgrade in a lot of places. Rasmus Anderson had a tough year. I mean, I think we shouldn't look past that. But if he just does, between being a right-hand shot that can jump into the play and produce some offense, but also, win puck battles, be very physical. I think the intangible side of his game, he just finished captaining the Swedish team at the World Hockey Championship. Basically ticks every box for what teams are looking for that are looking to upgrade a blue line. And so, his name's there. And then John Gibson, he's the most listed man on the trade boards. He's probably into about year 4 on the trade board. What speaks in favor for him? Really weak class of goaltending free agents. He's only down to 2 years left on his deal, and he had a really strong performance this year, bounce back season, I'd say, in Anaheim. So maybe, just maybe, it's the time for him to finally be moved along, because they have Lucas Dostal, of course, as the number one man for the Ducks now.
If I could ask about one more name, and everyone else listening, you can check out the rest of the list at theathletic.com. JJ Peterka at number 7 on your list, coming off a really good year in Buffalo. But the fact that he's on this list at all as an RFA, at least to me, I'm a bit surprised about that.
Well, I think there's question about whether he wants to be, there long term, right? The Sabres, Kevin Adams called him sort of a young core member of their franchise at the deadline when his name started to sort of circulate again at the last minute. And, it just seems like some of the indications are the player himself is looking for a fresh start. What the Sabres do is a little harder to know here. I mean, certainly Peterka is someone I would put on a list of players that could garner an offer sheet this summer, but while that's a threat and no team likes that, I mean, if you're the Sabres, you can also look at that like, well, okay, then we'll just get the contract we want with the player because we'll just match it. So there's still some, I think there's still some machinations that need to happen in terms of what happens next with Peterka. But, he had a really strong year in terms of his point production. I think he's still coming along as a all-around player. Some questions about his defensive play. But, he's only 23 years old and producing the way he has. That obviously is going to get the attention of teams that are looking for good young players, of which there's a lot of them out there. So I guess I would say stay tuned on Peterka. But, definitely get the feeling that, he and the organization aren't totally on the same page. And so, there's a couple ways sometimes, that can be worked through conversation and heart to heart or whatever you want to call it. And other times the best way is to go your separate ways, shake hands, and part ways. And so we'll see which way it goes in Buffalo. But certainly at this point, I would say a trade has to be considered a possibility.
All right. Stay tuned indeed. Again, you can check out the rest of CJ's trade board at The Athletic. Let's move on to the forming Stanley Cup Final matchup. Florida is already in. Edmonton just needs one more win, and they're in. We should focus on Florida first. We know they won, but all everyone wants to talk about is what was said in the little handshake line between Paul Maurice and Rod Brind'Amour, which Paul Maurice did address post-game about just wanting to have his own handshake line with the coaches and not wanting to get in with the players. And we've seen people since point out all these other examples where Paul Maurice has shaken players' hands. What did you think of the attention on the handshake line between Paul and Rod and Paul's explanation afterward? Well,
you couldn't help but, especially if you're watching the Canadian broadcast, which I was, you couldn't help but wonder about it because, it was shown pretty prominently. Credit to the crew producing that game, but they caught it in real time, and it was you could tell it was an unusual moment, a more extended conversation, and not a conversation what you usually see in the handshake line, which is something along the line of good series or good luck or go win a cup, or like we've all sort of know what the standard fare is in the handshake line. So very strange, but I will say Paul Maurice has hinted at this through the playoffs. I'll tell you a story I've heard. I've been told that something happened in the first round after the Tampa-Florida series in the handshake line. Now, I've been led to believe, I don't know the full story, so I'm just giving you what I've heard. I've always led to believe it was a positive thing. Like, I don't think it was a negative interaction. I should be very clear about that. But I wonder if that is sort of twigged this in some way. But, I think that was actually, those are two teams that have played each other a lot, interstate rivals, interdivision rivals. In fact, they've won the last 6 Prince of Wales trophies between them, those two organizations. So I think a lot of professional, healthy respect there. But there was something happened that night after Game 5 of that series in the handshake line. And again, I heard it was positive, so I don't want anyone to jump to conclusions here. And ever since then, Paul Maurice has mentioned multiple times in interviews, just stray comments. He doesn't think coaches belong in the handshake line. It's the players themselves that do battle. I guess in the Toronto series in round 2, him and Craig Berube, had worked something out where they didn't go through the line. It's a little strange. Let's call it as it is, but clearly it's something Paul feels strongly about. Really, I see the handshake line as just, it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's a chance to basically commend your opponent at the end of a hard-fought series. And granted, yes, the coaches don't do battle on the ice. They don't do physical battle. They don't lay in front of slap shots. They don't get mixed up in scrums in front of the net or even fight from time to time the way players do. But, they're down in the heat of things to a certain degree. Anyway, I don't have a hot take for you, but I do wonder if something happened that night based on what I've heard in round 1 that has changed. Paul Maurice has coached in this league forever, and he's been in a lot of handshake lines the last few years because all the Panthers do is keep winning playoff series. He's going to his 3rd straight Cup final, the first coach to do that in his first 3 years with a team since Scotty Bowman. I mean, anytime you're matching Scotty Bowman with a major achievement, you've done something right. So maybe this is giving him a chance to reflect on this. I don't know why the change at this late stage of his career. I suspect we may never get to the bottom of it, at least not while he's still behind the bench. But it was a notable moment at the end of that Carolina-Florida game. It was a hell of a, as quiet as that series started, and it actually finished with a couple of really good games. And, the Panthers are they're tough to beat right now. They can give up a tying goal. They can go behind in the game. You just feel like they have ultimate belief and their experience level, sort of the right combination of experience, skill, confidence, ability to dig in when things aren't going their way, and quite something when you make 3 straight Cup finals.
Yeah, they're inevitable at this point. That's as good as you could describe them at this point.
Are you picking them to win the Cup then, or are you taking them over Edmonton or maybe Dallas if the Stars have an unlikely comeback? Or?
I think I've lost a lot of hope in Dallas at this point, but I picked against Edmonton a lot. This is actually a good transition over to them. I picked against Edmonton the first round, and they've made me look silly since. I'm inclined to think this might be the year they actually do it. They have to get past Dallas first, and them losing Zach Hyman does not help their situation, but it's really hard to bet against 97 and 29.
That's fair. And look, and Stuart Skinner, who's been awesome since coming back in the net, especially after a tough start to the playoffs. And I picked Edmonton at the start of the year, so I'm just going to default to my original pick in this season. Yeah, I mean, we're not a big pick show anyway, but I'm with you. I do feel as though the Oilers are well positioned. If anyone can disrupt the Panthers, can knock them out of the playoffs, can derail this train. I mean, look, you mentioned the Zach Hyman injury, which is certainly significant, but Florida had to play games in the last round without Sam Reinhart. A2 Listerainen, who's I think an important part of that team, probably a little bit understatedly so, left injured in the last game. AJ Greer was in and out. Like I feel like the Panthers, Matthew Tkachuk probably hasn't been ever fully right since suffering the injuries he had at the Four Nations tournament. So I as much as I commend the Panthers and I admire them, and man, they were full value to get to this conference, to come through that conference final and get to the cup final again. They got to play for another 2 weeks in with the highest stakes possible. And so I think the Oilers can do it, but we'll have to see. I'm expecting a long series. I'll say that at the outset. I don't see one team as clearly better than, or clearly like they're going to just mow over the other one. I see a heavyweight fight on our hands, which means we got another 3 weeks maybe before summertime officially hits.
Of course, that all depends on if Edmonton gets the job done. Dallas, on the other side, their offense looks like they've dried out. Mikko Rantanen not scoring goals. Wyatt Johnston's plus minus has looked bad. I know Jason Robertson has goals in back-to-back games, but you want more from him too. And the Stars are down 3-1. They've never come back from a 3-1 series deficit in their team history. So it's a pretty uphill climb for them.
Absolutely. And this could be old takes exposed that you and I just immediately jumped to, setting up the rematch of last year's Stanley Cup Final before it's even been officially set. But, it does feel as though Edmonton will get the job done there. I guess, who knows? Maybe by Monday night, we're like, that was a mistake. But, the Stars are running short. But you know what? The flip side of that is it's easy to get ahead of yourself. 3-1 is not insurmountable. We've seen it done before. And in this case, I think it's a pretty obvious way you get it done. They, obviously the Stars have to take care of business at home ice in Game 5. They got to find a way to steal a game in Game 6. And then, they're on home ice for Game 7. It kind of lines up. If for a team trying to come back for 3-1, that lines up in a way you can do it. But we haven't seen their best hockey. The offense has dried up. Even Rantanen, for all the amazing heroics he had earlier in this playoffs, he hasn't been scoring either. I'm not putting this at his feet, but just feels like they need more offensive contributors. They need to break through. They played well in some of the games too, to be fair, and just not punctured the Oilers' defense or Stuart Skinner, and then they find themselves down, and it's tough to come back from a hole. So. The chips are on the line now, and they got a chance to make us look dumb for already counting them out before it's officially done.
Looking dumb on this show. That's never happened before. Anyway, yeah, we'll of course have continuing coverage of the Stanley Cup playoffs as they go. You're absolutely right on that, Siege. Before we get to stick taps, I want one big thought from you on the cast for season 2 of Face Off Inside the NHL, the Amazon Prime series that looked pretty decent in season 1. Season 2, the cast has expanded. Just to go through the names that look to be featured in season 2: Sidney Crosby, Marc-Andre Fleury, Anze Kopitar, Matthew Tkachuk, Mikko Rantanen, William Nylander, Thomas Harley, Quinton Byfield, Wyatt Johnston, Seth Jarvis, Sean Monahan, Brady Tkachuk, Zach Werenski, and Brendan Shanahan. Brendan Shanahan also part of the cast for season 2. What do you think?
I love it. I love that they have introduced, like a Shanahan type of character. It's not just about Brendan, but an off-ice person. I think they want to do more of that, assuming there are future seasons beyond this. It's a mix of younger players, known commodities, some names that, frankly, unless you're a hardcore hockey fan, you might not know much about Wyatt Johnston, for example, or even Seth Jarvis, for that matter, or go down the list, Thomas Harley. So I think it's a chance to both introduce some new characters to people that might, I know the hardest core hockey fans out there, which are probably the people listening to our show. You already know who these players are. You probably even know a little bit about their backgrounds, but I think it strikes the right balance between what these shows should be. Ultimately, we're going to measure this, and did they get enough cool moments and things that we haven't seen before? The fact that Crosby's involved, I'm intrigued by. Notoriously private guy, for as famous as he's been, for as long as he's been. Maybe we see something new. Maybe we learn something new about him. And as I say, I'm even curious to just see how much of the behind the scenes life with an executive like Brendan Shanahan and what turns out will be his final days in Toronto. We now know, there's some great possibilities there. So I love the first season. I understand it wasn't for everybody, or, some people want more and more and more. I thought it was pretty interesting. And I bet this one will be even better just because they've had more time to prepare for it. And it seems like they got a pretty good cast there. What say you?
Just show me more. That's all I want. You're going to give me all of these players. You're going to give me all of these personalities. We don't know that much about Sidney Crosby. I want to know more about him. Brady Tkachuk, obviously I get to see him every day in Ottawa. I'm very curious what they'll show on this series. They'll have both Tkachuk brothers who looked pretty fun together when they were doing the series last year. Very curious about this year. Mikko Rantanen, how much of the ups and downs of this season are we really going to see from him through this series? And Brendan Shanahan, of course.
I gotta say, Rantanen's an honest guy. I think there's high probability that he, gets into it, whatever it is, but whatever he wants to share about all that, I think it could be pretty good.
I'm looking forward to that. Sean Monahan and I think also Zach Werenski as well. I'm anticipating those two. Maybe we might get some of the most emotional parts of the series, considering they'll be playing this season without Johnny Gaudreau, obviously. That could be a really interesting part of this series. Quentin Byfield also as well, and his evolution as a young center playing in LA, and Anze Kopitar also being featured as well is going to be interesting. I just need to see what they're going to show me. I think the cast list looks really good. I want to get excited, but if I come away disappointed from this, I'll be really angry about it. There's a lot of potential for season 2, I think.
Yeah, and let's hope, look, they've been shooting all year. They were at the Four Nations. Obviously, in the run up to the playoffs, some of those players' teams didn't make the playoffs, and then in the Stanley Cup playoffs themselves. I think that they had more runway to make this even better than the first one. And I like the first one, even though sometimes I feel like I'm on an island in saying that. I
don't know. It's just, I'm with you on that island, because I thought season 1 was really interesting because it wasn't anything that we had seen. I shouldn't say not anything we had seen. I want more behind the scenes content. I want to know more about the best players in the National Hockey League, and I'm happy that Amazon is able to provide that platform. Just how much more are we going to be able to get? Also, no Oilers in this year's cast, which you could argue the most interesting person from last year's show was Connor McDavid. Basically, the biggest quotable thing from that season 1 was him yelling at his teammates during the Stanley Cup Final, and doesn't look as if we're going to get anyone from that team on this year's show.
Look, bless Connor for giving us that moment, for allowing them to keep that in. He probably feels like he did his part.
I guess that's fair. It's just, I don't know. I would have liked to have seen Amazon go back down that well. Anyway, we'll do like last year, and we'll give our thoughts on the series when they drop season 2 later on this fall. But yeah, seems very interesting. Do you have a stick tap before we go?
I do. He's not quite an old guy chasing the cup, but I couldn't help but feel a little stick tappy for Seth Jones in seeing, a player who spent the last couple of years in Chicago, obviously didn't have a very good time of it, was pretty open about that, gets the midseason trade to Florida, and he's played really well. I thought he was excellent, in particular in Game 7 and Round 2 against Toronto. But he's one of the new guys, right? The Panthers, for a lot of those players, some of them have been back now to 3 straight Cup Finals, but Seth Jones is one of the guys getting to do it for the first time, and I thought it was cool to see him go through. So stick tap to Seth. He must feel like he's got to pinch himself these days from where he was to where he is, and now he's got a chance to win a Stanley Cup.
I like that stick tap for Seth Jones. I will give mine. I was going to give one to Steve Dangle and reaching 250,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel, but I'll give it to Jaromir Jagr, because for the 45th consecutive year, and I know there's an asterisk on 2022, before the 45th consecutive year, a teammate of Jaromir Jagr's will play in the Stanley Cup Final. And I know it's Alexander Barkov, 30 year in a row and all that, but that is one of the coolest records, coolest stats, funny things, however you want to call it in sports. The fact that a teammate of Jaromir Jagr's is playing in the Cup Final for a 45th consecutive year. That's amazing.
I had no idea about that. But anytime you're stick tapping Jaromir Jagr, I'm in support because he's been one of the more interesting, compelling figures in my time around the sport.
For context, the asterisk on the 2022 year is on Andre Palat. He was a teammate of Jagr's at the Olympics, apparently, but still counts as a teammate. Still a teammate of Jaromir Jagr's. So the record still technically counts.
Yeah, and look, if we have to get into asterisks to get to 47, 48, 49 years, I'm all for it.
Me too. Great work as always, CJ. Be sure to check out his work at The Athletic. Get your questions in now for Ask CJ, and we'll be back early next week with a brand new episode of The CJ Show. Thanks so much for listening, guys.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.